Final gather settings are very important to the look of your rendering, so we need to spend some time getting familiar with the nuts and bolts of how final gather settings work. So what you see here is a rendering with just the draft preset for final gather. And if you look closely, you'll see there's a weird circle right here. That's actually a final gather point that's causing issues with our rendering. So we want to go in and tweak this so that we can clean this up. So I'm going to go into the render setup window to the indirect illumination tab, and we're going to spend some time looking at these parameters here. So the first ones we're going to see here are the initial final gather point density and the raise per final gather point. So the point density is the number of initial points that are sampled here. So in other words, final gather is view dependent. That means that you're going to get different results to your final gather depending upon the view. So it samples the scene from the point of view of the camera, and it goes through and it creates that kind of mosaic effect that you've seen. The initial sampling detail is controlled through this setting. So if we go through these different presets, and we can use this slider or we can use the same slider up here, either way. Notice, by the way, that it doesn't update down here. But in any event, as we go through here, you'll see these values change, and the draft value here is 0.1, and the upper end of the range is a value of 4. Well, I've never pushed this up to 4. I have never seen a need to do that. I would recommend values more like between 0.5 and 1 for final production renderings. So, for draft renderings, 0.1 is fine. In a lot of cases, I've been able to get away with a value of 0.5, and that's been okay. At the most, I've ever set it up to a value of 1. I'm not changing the other parameters just yet, but let's see what just changing that from 0.1 to 1.0 accomplishes. Let's make a copy of that and render. So we're getting better accuracy now. So you see, instead of this big splash over here, this big dot, we're seeing lots of little dots that are kind of superimposed here. So that's just one part of the equation here. We're going to need to adjust some of the other parameters to get a good result as well. So one of those other parameters is the raise per final gather point. So what that is for each sample on the view here, how many rays do we want to generate to sample the environment around that particular location? So this one, I would try to keep this low once again. A value of 50 is usually too low. I've found a value ranging from about 50 to about 200 to be a good range. Let's try splitting the difference between those and setting this to about 100. In general, the presets here are not terribly useful, and they tend to be too high, and you can usually get away with a lot lower settings. So now you'll see we're getting more samples and more sort of splash as a result of those samples. And if I increase this up to 200 and re-render, it's going to sort of spread out. And as I increase that value, we're going to get more accurate renderings. Now, we've still got a lot of garbage in here, but we're going to deal with that as well. So again, initial point density, I would range that between 0.1 and 1.0. And raise per final gather point, I would range between about 50 and 200.